As I've mentioned a couple of times, things are very different this day because we move from Palm Sunday and that great celebration and that wonderful joy into the rest of the week. And it's a difficult week. It's an uncomfortable week. It's a week that challenges us, regardless of our faith, regardless of what's going on in our world and in our lives. Holy Week confronts us. And so our worship concludes, but in a somewhat lengthy way, with a scripture reading. We read the Passion story, which in Mark's Gospel is amazingly long. Mark's Gospel is really, really short. And a theme that runs throughout Mark's Gospel is this incredible theme that from the moment Jesus began to proclaim God's love for all people, the world decided it was time to get rid of him. Mark's Gospel is in an insane hurry. By insane, I mean if you simply add up the dates in Mark's Gospel and have none other, from the day Jesus begins his ministry, he's around for 3 to 5 months before he's killed. And when we come to the story that I am about to read, it's a long one. Mark wants us to spend some time really thinking about what we, the world, did to God. It's not a pleasant story. And we're going to leave today's worship at the end of that story, at the end of chapter 15, and it's not a great chapter. Because it's a chapter that ends with Jesus dying and being buried. We all know that that happened, but if you're like me, you somehow wish you could blink your eyes and already be at Easter, right? Because Easter's a much better story. And we'll get there. We will get there next Sunday, no matter what happens between now and then. And I know that in this world, that's really wide open. Anything could happen. But whatever happens between now and next Sunday, it will still be Easter. It will still be God bursting out of the tomb saying, "You can't get rid of me. You can't shut me up. Because my love is too great, my promise too wide for anyone to ever put it out." Because we know that truth, because we know that next Sunday is coming, today we can read the other story. And just before I read it, I want to invite you to think, as I read it, about who you might be in this story. It begins, interestingly, Mark's version begins with the story of a woman anointing Jesus and being ridiculed for it, being challenged for it. And so we can ponder, might we be the person that dares to do something kind and loving, knowing that people will tell horrendous things about us? Are we Peter? The guy who has the best of intentions. Peter always has the best of intentions, and Peter always tries to do the right thing, and Peter doesn't. Sometimes that's me. I know what the right thing is, and I want to do it, and I promise to do it, and I know I'm going to do it, and then I don't. Or are we like any of the other male disciples? There's an interesting thing in Mark's Gospel where we have to confront the reality that every single one of the men leaves. Even though they all say, "I'll be with you right to the end," they don't mean it. Are we like the women who stay there through the end, who stay and watch Jesus die in agonizing pain? but who get to be the first ones a couple of days later to meet the risen Christ? Are we like Judas? Do we think that we've got a better idea? Because we do, don't we? We often think we've got a better idea than God does. Doesn't pay off. Are we like Pilate, who's just too scared to stick with his own convictions? Let us contemplate those people and hear the story from Mark 14 and 15. In only 2 days, the 8-day festival of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread would begin. The high priests and the religion scholars were looking for a way that they could seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. They agreed that it shouldn't be during Passover week because we don't want the crowd up in arms, they said. Jesus was at Bethany, a guest of Simon the leper, and while he was eating dinner, a woman came up carrying a bottle of very expensive perfume. Opening the bottle, she poured it on his head, and some of the guests became furious among themselves. That's criminal. A sheer waste. This perfume could have been sold for well over a year's wages, and the money could have been given to the poor. And they swelled up in anger, nearly bursting with indignation over her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why are you giving her a hard time? She's just done something wonderfully significant for me. You'll have the poor with you every day for the rest of your lives. Whenever you feel like it, you can do something for them. But not so with me. She did what she could when she could. She pre-anointed my body for burial, and you can be sure that wherever in the whole world the message is preached, what she just did is going to be talked about admiringly." Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the cabal of high priests and leaders and determined to betray Jesus. They couldn't believe their ears. They promised to pay him well. He started looking for just the right moment to hand him over. Now, on the first day of the days of unleavened bread, the day they prepare the Passover sacrifice, the disciples asked Jesus, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations so that we can eat the Passover meal together?" And Jesus directed 2 of his disciples, "Go into the city and you'll see a fellow carrying a water jug. Follow him. Ask the owner of whichever house he enters, 'The teacher wants to know, where is my guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?' He'll show you a spacious 2nd-story room, swept and ready. You can prepare the meal there." The disciples left. They came to the city. They found everything just as Jesus had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. And after sunset, Jesus came with the 12, and as they were at the supper table eating, Jesus said, "I have something very hard but important to say to you. One of you is going to hand me over to the conspirators, one who at this very moment is eating with me." Stunned, they started asking each other, "It's not me, is it?" And Jesus said, it is one of you. It's one of you 12. It's one who eats with me out of the very same bowl. In one sense, it turns out that the Son of Man is entering into a way of treachery well marked by the Scriptures. No surprises at all. But in another sense, the one who turns him in, who turns traitor, it would be better never to have been born than to do this. And in the course of their meal, having taken and blessed the bread, Jesus broke it and gave it to them. And he said, "Take, this is my body." And taking the chalice, he gave it to them and thanked God, and they all drank from it. And he said, "This is my blood, God's new covenant poured out for many, many people. I won't be drinking wine again until the new day when I drink it in the realm of God." And they sang a hymn and they went directly to the Mount of Olives. Jesus told them, "You're all going to feel that your world is falling apart and that it's my fault. There's a scripture that says, 'I'll strike the shepherd and the sheep will go helter-skelter. But after I'm raised up, I will go ahead of you, leading the way to Galilee.'" Oh, Peter blurted out, "Even if everyone else is ashamed of you when things fall to pieces, I won't be." Jesus said, "Don't be so sure, Peter. Today, this very night, in fact, before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. He blustered in protest. "Oh no, even if I have to die with you, I'll never deny you." And all the others said the same thing. And they came to an area called Gethsemane. And Jesus told his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter and James and John with him, and he plunged into a sinkhole of dreadful agony. And he told them, "I feel bad enough right now to die. Will you stay here and keep watch with me?" And going ahead a little bit, he fell to the ground and he prayed for a way out. "Papa, you can't you? You can get me out of this. Take this cup away from me, but don't do what I want. Do what you want." He came back and he found the sound asleep. And he said to Peter, "Simon, you went to sleep on me. Can't you stick it out with me for just an hour? Stay alert, be in prayer so you don't enter the danger zone without even knowing it. Don't be naive. Part of you is eager, ready for anything in God, but another part of you is as lazy as an old dog sleeping by the fire." And then Jesus went back and prayed the same prayer. And returning again, he found them sound asleep. They simply couldn't keep their eyes open, and they didn't have any excuse. And Jesus came back a 3rd time and said, "Are you going to sleep all night? No. You've slept long enough. Time's up. The Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let's get going. My betrayer has arrived." No sooner were the words out of his mouth when Judas, one out of the 12, showed up, and with him a gang of ruffians, and they were sent by the high priests and the religion scholars and the leaders, and they had swords and clubs. And the betrayer had worked out a signal with them. "The one that I kiss," he said, "that's the one. You seize him. Make sure he doesn't get away." And Judas went straight to Jesus and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. And then they grabbed him and roughed him up. Now one of the men standing there unsheathed his sword, and he swung and he came down on the chief priest's servant and he lopped off the fellow's ear. Jesus said to them, "What is this? Coming after me with swords and clubs as if I were a dangerous criminal? Day after day I've been sitting in the temple teaching, and you never so much as lifted a hand against me. What you've done confirms what the prophets had said." And all the disciples cut and ran. There was a young man following along, and all he had on was a bed sheet, and some of the men grabbed him, but he got away and ran off naked, leaving them holding the sheet. And they led Jesus to the high priest, where all the other priests and the religion scholars had gathered together, and Peter followed at a safe distance until they got to the chief priest's courtyard, where he mingled with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the high priests were conspiring with the Jewish council, and they looked high and low for evidence against Jesus by which they could sentence him to death, and they found absolutely nothing. Oh, plenty of people were willing to bring in false charges, but nothing could add up, and they ended up canceling each other out. A few of them stood up and lied and said, "We heard him say, apparently, I'm going to tear down this temple. It's built by hard labor. In 3 days, I'll just build another one, and I won't even lift my hand." But even they couldn't agree exactly. So in the middle of all of this, the chief priest stood up and said to Jesus, "What do you have to say against our accusations?" Jesus was silent. He said nothing. So the chief priest tried again. He said, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the most blessed God?" Jesus said, "Yes, I am. And you'll see it yourself. The Son of Man seated at the right hand of mighty God, arriving on the clouds of heaven." Well, the chief priest lost his temper. Ripping his clothes, he screamed, "Did you hear that? We don't need any more witnesses. You heard his blasphemy. Are you going to stand for it?" And they condemned him, every one of them. They sentenced him to death. Some of them started spitting at him. They blindfolded his eyes, and then they hit him and said, "Who hit you, huh? Prophesy if you're so smart." And the guards, punching and slapping, took Jesus away. Now, while all this was going on, Peter was down in the courtyard. One of the chief priest's servant girls came in, and seeing Peter warming himself there, she looked hard at him and she said, "You were with that Nazarene, Jesus." He denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about." He went out onto the porch and a rooster crowed. The girl spotted him and she began telling the people standing around, "He's one of them." But he denied it again. And after a little while, the bystanders brought it up again. "You've got to be one of them. You've got Galilean written all over you." And now Peter got really nervous and he swore, "I never laid eyes on this guy you're talking about." Just then a rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said, "Before a rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. And he collapsed in tears. At dawn's first light, the high priests with the religion leaders and scholars arranged a conference with the entire Jewish council. After tying Jesus securely, they took him out and they presented him to Pilate. So Pilate said to him, "Tell me, are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "If you say so." The high priests let loose a barrage of accusations. And so Pilate asked him again, "Aren't you going to say anything?" That's quite a list of accusations. But still Jesus said nothing. Pilate was impressed, very impressed. But it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner, anyone the people asked for. There was one prisoner called Barabbas, locked up with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the uprising against Rome. And as the crowd came up and began to present its petition for him to release a prisoner, Pilate anticipated them. "So would you like me to release the King of the Jews to you?" Pilate asked. He knew by this time it was through sheer spite that the high priests had turned Jesus over to him in the first place. But the high priests by then had worked up the crowd to ask for the release of Barabbas. Pilate came back. "So what do I do with this man you call King of the Jews?" And they yelled, "Nail him to a cross." Pilate objected. "But for what crime?" And they yelled all the louder, "Nail him to a cross." Pilate gave the crowd what it wanted, and he set Barabbas free, and he turned Jesus over for whipping and crucifixion. The soldiers took Jesus into the palace called the Praetorium, and they called together the entire brigade. They dressed him up in purple and put a crown plaited from a thorn bush on his head, and they began their mockery. "Bravo, King of the Jews!" And they banged on his head with a club, and they spit on him, and they knelt down in mock worship. And after they'd had their fun, they took off the purple cape and put his own clothes back on him, and they marched him out to nail him to the cross. There was a man walking by coming from work, Simon from Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Yeah? And they made him carry Jesus' cross. And they brought Jesus to Golgotha, a place that meant Skull Hill. And they offered him a mild painkiller, wine mixed with myrrh, but he wouldn't take it. And they nailed him to the cross. And they divided up his clothes and they threw dice to see who would get them. They nailed him up at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the charge against him, the King of the Jews, was printed on a poster. Along with him, they crucified two criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. People passing along the road jeered, shaking their heads in mock lament. You bragged you could tear down the temple and then rebuild it in 3 days, so show us your stuff. Save yourself. If you're really God's son, come down from that cross. The high priests, along with the religion scholars, were right there, mixing it up with the rest of them, having a great time poking fun at him. He saved others, can't save himself. Messiah, huh? King of Israel. Climb down from that cross, King, then we'll all become believers. Come on. And even the men crucified alongside him joined in the mockery. At noon, the sky became extremely dark. The darkness lasted for 3 hours. At 3 o'clock, Jesus groaned out of the depths, crying loudly, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? Some of the bystanders who heard him mistook, and they said, listen, I think he's calling for Elijah. Someone ran off and soaked a sponge in sour wine and put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink, saying, let's see if Elijah comes to rescue him. But with a loud cry, Jesus gave his last breath. And at that moment, the temple curtain ripped right down the middle. When the Roman captain standing guard in front of him saw that he had quit breathing, he said, this has to be the Son of God. There were some women watching from a distance, among them Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph and Salome. And when Jesus was in Galilee, these women followed and served him and had come up with him to Jerusalem. Late in the afternoon, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a highly respected member of the Jewish council, came. He was one who did live expectantly, on the lookout always for the realm of God. Working up his courage, he went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate questioned whether he could be dead that soon and called for the captain to verify that he was really gone. Assured by the captain, he gave Joseph the corpse. Having already purchased a linen shroud, Joseph took him down, wrapped him in the shroud, placed him in a tomb that had been cut into the rock, and rolled a large stone across the opening. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, watched as Jesus was buried.